When World War II ended, the world finally learned the horrifying truth about what had happened inside the Nazi concentration and extermination camps. The details left people in shock. One of the most unsettling things was how many war criminals at the Nuremberg trials tried to defend themselves by saying, "I was only following orders." But what surprised people even more was that some of the most ruthless figures weren't men, they were women. In news footage, female overseers called Aufseherinnen in German could be seen smirking, as if they felt no guilt for what they had done. When some of them were interviewed, they spoke with arrogance, and some even seemed proud of their actions. These women were responsible for brutal whippings, relentless beatings, torture, forcing prisoners to stand for hours in unbearable weather, sudden executions, and the notorious selection process. Today we're diving into the dark world of the women who played a role in the Holocaust and the terrifying things they did to their victims. Ilse Koch. As trials for Nazi concentration camp staff continued, the world got a deeper look into how twisted and sadistic some of these women were. But one of the most infamous figures wasn't even a member of the SS. She was just the wife of a Nazi officer until she earned the title of the Queen of Buchenwald. Others called her the Beast of Buchenwald, and some gave her an even harsher name, the Bitch of Buchenwald. Ilse Koch was married to Karl Koch, an SS officer who became Commandant of Buchenwald in 1937 after learning the ways of camp administration and cruelty at Sachsenhausen. As the wife of a high-ranking official, Ilse had power and she used it without hesitation. Nobody, not even the guards, dared to challenge her, knowing she was protected by her husband's status. Maybe in a normal world, things would have been different, but in the brutal reality of a concentration camp, power was everything. Ilse Koch thrived on control, wealth, and luxury, more specifically, the things money could buy her. Eventually, both she and her husband were caught and convicted by an SS court for fraud and embezzlement. Karl Koch was executed by a German firing squad in the final days of the war, while Ilse served 16 months in a German prison before being released just before the war ended. One of the things she spent her stolen money on was a massive equestrian arena, built simply because she loved to ride. The price? The lives of several prisoners who either died from exhaustion or were outright killed during its construction. She also had the SS whip people at her command for reasons as trivial as not liking how they looked at her or simply disliking their appearance. At times, she would taunt prisoners just to get a reaction, then have them brutally beaten. What made Ilse Koch truly infamous, though, was her obsession with tattoos, especially on male prisoners. One of the doctors at Buchenwald during her time, Erich Weiger, had been conducting research on tattoos and criminal behavior. Part of his study involved using the skin of murdered prisoners, which, according to testimonies, was also collected for Ilse. After the war, authorities discovered lampshades and book covers made from human skin at Buchenwald, but there was no direct evidence linking them to her. Even without that proof, Koch was found guilty of inciting murder and numerous other crimes. She was sentenced to life in prison, where she remained until she took her own life in 1967. Irma Grese was an SS overseer at Ravensbrück, a women's concentration camp located about 50 miles north of Berlin. Unlike other camps, Ravensbrück was almost entirely run by female guards except for the commandant, his officers, and the men stationed in the watchtowers. For those unfamiliar with its role, this camp served as the main training ground for female overseers. It was here that Grese and others we'll discuss in this video earned what could only be called degrees in brutality. Grese was just 10 years old when Hitler rose to power. She came from a troubled home, dropped out of school, and ran away at 15. She eventually found work at an SS hospital, where she was constantly exposed to Nazi propaganda. She fully embraced what she was told about enemies of the state, and, in particular, the Jewish people. At 15, she wanted to join the League of German Girls, but her father forbade it. In defiance, she doubled down on her beliefs and, by 17, had volunteered as an SS overseer at Ravensbrück. After her time there, Grese was transferred to Auschwitz-Birkenau, where her cruelty only intensified. During the long and exhausting roll calls, if a prisoner collapsed from weakness, she wouldn't hesitate to stomp on them with her heavy, hobnailed boots. Like many other camp guards, she was quick to punish even the slightest sign of what she considered disrespect, whether real or imagined, often executing prisoners on the spot. As you can see from the images, Irma Grese didn't look like the embodiment of evil. She appeared ordinary, almost like a typical housewife. Some even compared her to a character out of a Monty Python skit. Despite this, she was given the nickname the Beautiful Beast during and after the war, a title she reportedly believed suited her. But her interest in beauty wasn't admiration, it was resentment. She had a particular hatred for attractive women, not out of desire but jealousy. Irma Grese was known for targeting women she considered beautiful. She would single them out and whip them viciously, often using a specially braided whip designed to cause severe pain. After enduring this abuse, these women were often deemed unfit for work and sent straight to the gas chambers. Grese also played a direct role in mass killings. She worked alongside Dr. Joseph Mengele and other Nazi officials during the selections that happened when new trainloads of prisoners arrived. She helped decide who would be sent to forced labor and who would be sent to their deaths, contributing to the murder of tens of thousands. After the war, she was put on trial in a British court for war crimes. Found guilty of mass murder, she was sentenced to death and hanged at just 22 years old, making her the youngest woman ever executed under British law. Herman Braunsteiner's story is shocking, not just for her crimes but for what happened after the war. When she died in 1999, her full name was Hermine Braunsteiner Ryan. That's because by the 1960s, she had managed to reinvent herself as a housewife in Queens, New York, where she was well liked by her neighbors, who had no idea of her past. After the war, she was held in internment camps for suspected war criminals until 1947. In 1949, Austrian authorities had her sent back to face trial. She was convicted of crimes against human dignity and sentenced to 3 years in prison. However, because of the time she had already spent in custody, she served only a few months and was released in early 1950. She managed to avoid a harsher sentence for her crimes at the Majdanek extermination camp due to a lack of witnesses. There were two main reasons for this. Majdanek was primarily a death camp, meaning most of its prisoners did not survive, and those who did were either lost in the chaos of post-war Europe, unaware of the trial, or simply wanted to move on from the trauma. In 1958, Hermine Braunsteiner married an American tourist named Russell Ryan. The couple first moved to Canada before settling in the United States in 1959. By 1963, she had become a U.S. citizen, blending into life as a quiet housewife in Queens, New York. Simon Wiesenthal, a Holocaust survivor turned Nazi hunter, came across Majdanek survivors in Israel who had gathered detailed information about her crimes. With their help, he alerted the New York Times, which sent a young Jewish-American reporter to Braunsteiner's home. The moment she opened the door, she realized she had been exposed. Though she tried to downplay her role, the truth had surfaced. Her husband, unaware of the full extent of her past, tried to defend her, insisting my wife wouldn't hurt a fly. He mistakenly believed she had worked in the infirmary at Majdanek and Ravensbrück. In reality, she was notorious for brutally stomping prisoners to death, earning her the nickname the Stomping Mare. It took 5 years for U.S. authorities to revoke her citizenship. Eventually, Braunsteiner was extradited to Germany, where she was convicted of mass murder and crimes against humanity. She was found guilty of whipping 2 women to death and was sentenced to life in prison in 1981. Due to health issues, she was released in 1996 and died in Bochum, Germany, 3 years later. Herta Oberhäuser, the Doctor of Horror. Another case of injustice involved Herta Oberhäuser, one of the defendants in the infamous doctor's trial at Nuremberg in 1994-647. Like many others, she had served at Ravensbrück, but unlike most, she wasn't just a guard, she was a doctor. Oberhäuser worked as an assistant to Karl Gebhardt, the SS's chief surgeon, and Heinrich Himmler's personal physician, but their work had nothing to do with healing people. Instead, they were at Ravensbrück to conduct horrific medical experiments on prisoners. These so-called studies were often inspired by or connected to similar inhumane research being carried out in other Nazi camps. The logic behind their brutality was simple. Once you strip people of their humanity, it becomes easier to treat them as disposable test subjects. Their physical state worsened by starvation, disease, and abuse was used as further justification for their treatment. regardless of the real cause of their suffering, the Nazis themselves. Gerda Oberhuser participated in some of the most horrific experiments conducted by the SS Medical Corps. Among her many atrocities were infecting open wounds with acids and bacteria to observe how quickly infections spread, transplanting healthy organs between prisoners, and harvesting organs from the recently deceased for experimental procedures. She even performed bone transplants without anesthesia. But beyond the gruesome experiments, she also seemed to take pleasure in tormenting her victims. When women begged for water, she would give them some mixed with vinegar. At the doctor's trial, Oberhuser was the only woman among the defendants. She was sentenced to 20 years in prison, but in 1951, her sentence was reduced due to protests against the long imprisonments of former Nazis. Shockingly, she served only a year before being released for good behavior. Even more disturbing, she managed to regain her medical license and resume work as a doctor. The exact circumstances remain unclear whether lost records or the help of former Nazi officials allowed her to slip through the cracks. For 6 years, she practiced as a family doctor near Kiel on Germany's North Sea coast before finally having her license revoked for good. She spent her final years in a retirement home, passing away in 1978.